Ladies, gentlemen, friends, and colleagues, welcome to the National Museum of the United States Army. We are so pleased to join you again this evening for our monthly book talk. I'm going to turn you over to the capable hands of Dr. John Moss.
Okay, welcome everyone. Appreciate you being here with us once again for a great talk that's going to come up about the one of the turning points, possibly the most significant turning points, the Revolutionary War. Glad you're with us, everyone, on our virtual program here. And let me introduce our speaker tonight. Colonel Retired Kevin Weddle is Professor of Military Theory and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College, Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. He is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and served 29 years as a combat engineer officer. Throughout his career, he worked in a variety of command and staff positions in the United States and overseas, and he's a veteran of Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm and Operation Enduring Freedom. Colonel Weddle's assignments included the U.S. Army War College faculty. Now, at the War College, he was the director of the Advanced Strategic Art Program, served as Deputy Dean of Academics, and held the General Maxwell D. Taylor Chair in the Profession of Arms. He has also earned the Army War College's Excellence in Teaching Award. Colonel Weddle holds a master's degree in history and civil engineering from the University of Minnesota and a PhD in history from Princeton University. He has written numerous articles for popular and scholarly journals, and his first book was Lincoln's Tragic Admiral, The Life of Samuel Francis DuPont, which came out back in 2005. So, Kevin, welcome to you. We really appreciate you being here, and a very good evening to you, sir.
Well, thanks, John, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really happy to be here, and especially since it's the National Museum of the United States Army, being an Army guy myself. So I can't wait to get down there to see that beautiful facility. And being an old engineer officer, of course, you know, I did my basic course and advanced course at Fort Belvoir, your location. So it's a wonderful place down there. So I'm looking forward to seeing it. And thanks to everybody for Zooming in tonight.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Before we get started in the narrative, Kevin, I wanted to ask you, I'm a big fan of Saratoga, and I always seem to get everything that comes out in books and articles on it. And I've noticed we've had your book just came out recently. Don Troiani and Eric Schnitzer came out with an excellent book maybe a year or two ago. Mm-hmm. We've had John Ludzader. What do you think accounts for not only the research interest and the writing interest about Saratoga campaign, but also people buying books and getting interested in it?
Yeah, well, you know, I think there's been a renaissance in interest in the American Revolution over these past maybe 20 years. And I think that the literature, the expanded literature on Saratoga is certainly a part of that. But then Saratoga itself, I think, has a lot of, there's just so many interesting things about the Saratoga campaign. The personalities are about as interesting as you'll ever find. Of course, you could say that for a lot of things in the American Revolution. The fact that there's so many moving parts in the Saratoga campaign, when you look at the Saratoga campaign writ large, and not just focused on the last two battles, which many people do. So if you look at the entire campaign, there's just so many interesting things happening in the entire campaign. So I just think it has and you know, your audience voted it as the most significant turning point of the war. People recognize, I think, that it's important strategically, and so I think that's another reason why it's a subject that draws people in.
So as you say, it has to be understood kind of in a broader picture. And part of that, I think what you're getting at in the beginning of your book is that the campaign really can't be understood without relating it to Howe's Philadelphia campaign.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about how those two seemingly separate campaigns were really very related?
Absolutely. and I think that's one of the things that sort of differentiates my book with some of these others. Not to say that they're not great books, because they are. I think my book kind of complements some of these other books, because I do look at it from a very wide perspective. I mean, I start very, very early, talking about the 1776 campaign, which is really important, because that was the first attempt to go down Lake Champlain, or south on Lake Champlain rather, all the way to the aftermath, when the British are trying to come up with a new strategy in the aftermath of Saratoga and so on. So as part of that, I think you really need to look at, and I spent a lot of time on it, look at the strategic origins of the Saratoga campaign. And as you said, the Philadelphia campaign is absolutely critical to what happens at Saratoga. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And if you don't mind, I'd like to share my screen here and talk a little bit about the origins of this issue. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, so basically, you need to take a look at the development of British military strategy in 1777, and these are the key players there. So if you look at we'll start at the top and then go clockwise around the horn there. At the top of King George III, he's involved in the strategy formulation process. He's intimately involved with personnel decisions and recommendations and things like that. To the right there is General Sir William Howe. So General Sir William Howe, he's the commander-in-chief in North America minus Canada. And at the bottom there is Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, who in early 1777, he's actually in London. And so he is going to present a plan. And on the left is Lord George Germain, who's Secretary of State for the Colonies. He's the man responsible really for managing the war in North America. So what happens is in early 1777, both General Howe, the commander-in-chief with his headquarters in New York, and Lieutenant General Burgoyne, who happens to be in London at the time, will present two plans for winning the war in America. So Burgoyne's plan is one that I think most people are probably pretty familiar with. It calls for 3 converging columns. One column coming down from Canada. That's going to be the main army led by Burgoyne himself. They'll come down, or south rather, on Lake Champlain, seize Fort Ticonderoga, and move on to Albany. Another supporting column will also come down from Canada. They'll go down the St. Lawrence River, actually up the St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario, and then down the Mohawk River, also going to Albany. And then finally, General Howe's main army will come up the Hudson River, and those units will then basically form a junction at Albany with the goal of splitting the more rebellious New England colonies away from what they thought were the less rebellious middle colonies and southern colonies. So that's sort of the idea behind Burgoyne's plan. And then they also call for some sort of unspecified future operations into New England. Okay, so that's Burgoyne's plan. Howe will also present a plan as well. Now, by this time, Howe has recognized, and I think it's important to know this, Howe has recognized that, or at least he argues, that the center of gravity, he doesn't use those terms, but the center of gravity of the American Revolution is the main American army under George Washington. So his idea is, I'm going to take my big army there in New York City, I'm going to move it to Philadelphia, I'm going to seize Philadelphia. That's going to force Washington to come out and fight me, because he's going to have to defend the nominal capital of the rebels, because that's where the seat of Congress is. It's going to force Washington to come out and fight me, and I'll be able to get a decisive battle, destroy Washington. I destroy Washington, I win the rebellion, all right, I end the rebellion. So there's Philadelphia there. So he first thinks about traveling cross country, across New Jersey. He really doesn't have much of a stomach for doing that because of it's going to be hard for him to guard his lines of communications and all sorts of things like that. So he basically will call on his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, who commands the Royal Navy in North America, to basically provide him with the transports and warships to move his army by sea to Philadelphia. So that's what he's going to decide to do ultimately. So his plan is to take the army, move it by sea. He considers going up the Delaware. He'll end up going up the Chesapeake Bay. He'll land south of Philadelphia ultimately, and then move on Philadelphia. And then the plan will call for, well, basically we'll assume that Washington will come and defend Philadelphia. So now it's because he's handed these two different plans, it's up to Germain to reconcile this. So it's either pick one and go with it, or somehow coordinate these two plans so they're all pulling on the same rope, they're all working together. Now, because they're 3,000 miles away from each other, rather, the king, Burgoyne, and Germain are all in London. Howe is in New York. They're 3,000 miles away. That makes it very, very difficult to coordinate this, a plan, a strategy for 1777. And as you might expect, what's going to happen is instead of one coordinated strategy, military strategy for 1777, what ends up happening is there's two uncoordinated campaigns that are both approved by Germain and the king. And so there's a muddled strategy. It's not coordinated. It's not synced in any way. So but the best thing you can say about it, it's a very flawed strategy as you go into 1777. So Howe's Philadelphia campaign, to go back to your original question, is really important because Burgoyne's plan, remember, had called for Howe to come up the Hudson River. Well, Germain and the king approve Howe's plan to go to Philadelphia, but then they add a caveat. They say, once you're done with that Philadelphia campaign, then you need to help Burgoyne. Well, it shows, I think, when they do that, and again, Howe is 3,000 miles away, it takes messages just 6 weeks sometimes to travel, especially traveling east to west, because it's against prevailing winds. It's hard for a sailing ship, it takes a while. When there's that sort of communications gap, you're obviously not getting the messages in a timely fashion. And they also totally they underestimate how long it will take Howe to conduct the Philadelphia campaign. So it's really unrealistic when they tell Howe, go ahead and conduct your Philadelphia campaign, but then when you're done, make sure you go help Burgoyne. So basically, that's a kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but it's the flawed strategy for 1777 that will lead to almost everything that happens in the Saratoga campaign.
Okay, let's move to the American side. So there were some really key players, some interesting personalities for sure.
Yep.
Originally, well, let me back up. We all associate the victor of Saratoga with Horatio Gates, but really there was somebody else who kind of laid the groundwork of a lot of the logistics and recruiting,
For sure.
especially in New York, Philip Schuyler. Can you go into a little detail on their relationship and also Gates's key subordinate, his so-called combat general?
Yeah. So Schuyler and Gates are working together in the 1776 campaign up in New York. Schuyler is commanding the Northern Department, so that entire theater of operations up there in New York. And Gates is responsible for Fort Ticonderoga. So when the British attempt their first invasion of New York, coming south on Lake Champlain. They get as far as Crown Point. Before that, they fight the famous Battle of Valcour Island, with Benedict Arnold, of course, leading the American naval forces there in the Battle of Valcour Island. But once they get to Crown Point, which is just north of Ticonderoga, Carleton makes the decision that it's too late in the year. He doesn't have time to be able to seize Fort Ticonderoga, probably having to conduct a siege. And so he doesn't want to get caught in the winter, so he decides to retreat back to Canada. So Gates and Schuyler work well together during that period of time. Schuyler proves himself as a decent manager and a really smart logistician. And he's from the Albany area, so he knows the local terrain very, very, very well. He's very familiar with that area. He's got some relationships with a lot of the units and a lot of commanders up there. He understands the whole Native American issue up there as well. So, but they have a little bit of a falling out. Their relationship gets a little bit fraught, and so Gates leaves the Northern Department, and he rejoins the main army. So as you get into the early spring of 1777, Schuyler decides to leave the department, and he goes down to Philadelphia, where he's basically arguing his case. He feels like he's been badly treated by Congress. So he goes down there and he's basically pleading his case. In the meantime, Congress sends Gates back up to the Northern Department with the orders to go command at Ticonderoga again. Well, Gates gets up there and he sees that there's basically a leadership vacuum because Schuyler has left. And he takes it upon himself to take command of the Northern Department with his headquarters in Albany. So what you have is this situation where there's nobody really in charge. And there's a lot of confusion up there in the Northern Department and in the colonial governments that are surrounding that area on who's really in charge. Is it Schuyler in charge or is it Gates in charge? And Congress and Washington really don't step in to fix that unity of command issue in the Northern Department until May of 1777, when finally Congress will appoint or reappoint Schuyler as the proper commander of the Northern Department. He goes back up. He basically replaces Gates. So Gates goes off in a huff. He's very upset. He thinks he's been poorly treated. So Schuyler's back up in the Northern Department. He does the best he can with time running out, basically, before the British will start their invasion, to get the Northern Army, Northern Department ready to go, because everybody pretty much assumes that the British will try another invasion from Canada again in late spring, summer of 1777. So Schuyler does a pretty good job, but once and in fact, he even goes to Fort Ticonderoga and he tries to help the situation up there. But the bottom line is Ticonderoga really isn't ready to go by the time the British finally get there on the 2nd of July of 1777. Once Ticonderoga is seized, though, Schuyler does a pretty good job of kind of reforming the shattered Northern Army after the loss of Ticonderoga. He does a pretty decent job slowing down Burgoyne in his advance southward. But Schuyler's major problem is the attitude that he presents to Congress and to George Washington. And that is after Ticonderoga, he writes, and I document this in the book. He writes this series of just fatalistic, pessimistic letters, and this kind of he kind of personifies this oh, woe is me sort of attitude, and Washington and Congress are sort of appalled by this attitude. here's the commander of this very important theater, and he's thinking all is lost. There's nothing that they can do to stop Burgoyne. When in reality, Schuyler was actually doing a pretty good job. He just wasn't he wasn't reflecting that in the letters he was sending to Congress and Washington. And so ultimately, they're just going to get fed up with his pessimistic, fatalistic attitude, and they're going to relieve him in early August of 1777 and replace him with Horatio Gates, who's very popular in New England. Horatio Gates is very popular with the militia, whereas Schuyler is not popular at all with the militia. That's a problem. So Gates comes in and he takes over from Schuyler right after the American victory at Bennington, at the Battle of Bennington on the 16th of August of 1777. So when Gates takes over, Gates comes into a pretty, he comes into a situation that's almost tailor-made for his skills. That's kind of what I argue. I mean, there's a lot of historians who really, I think they look at Gates through the lens of what happens to him later at the Battle of Camden, and the Conway cabal and his attempt to but basically replace Washington. So they look at him through this backward lens instead of looking at what he did, at Saratoga based on what was going on then. And he's got some skills. He's a good logistician, like Schuyler. He's a good manager. He understands militia and what they can do and what they can't do, and he has a good relationship with them. Unlike a lot of his contemporaries who can sort of look down their noses at the militia, he sees their value. And again, he's got this really good relationship with New England, the New England delegates in Congress, New England governors, and that sort of thing. And he's a defensive-minded general. So all of that, when he takes over the Northern Army, facing Burgoyne, as Burgoyne is continuing to move south, he takes over at a perfect time, where a defensive battle is probably called for, or defensive-minded general is called for. Burgoyne is getting weaker as he continues farther south, whereas the American army is getting stronger during this time that he takes over. Again, his militia, his relationship with the militia and all that, it all works to his advantage. It's almost a situation that's tailor-made for Gates's skill set. Now, his relationship with Arnold. He had a really good relationship with Arnold in the 1776 campaign. They had some, issues, but for the most part, they had a good relationship. In fact, Gates defends Arnold against detractors in Congress. In fact, at one point I'll probably butcher the quote, but at one point he writes that men of little ability are often jealous of those with much, or something like that, and he's referring to Arnold. Arnold is already there in the Northern Department. Washington has sent Arnold up to help Schuyler. So Arnold's already there, and so Gates is happy to see him. Arnold is happy to see Gates, and he writes this effusive letter to Gates when he finds out that Gates is taking command, saying, "Hey, it's great to work with you again. Glad you're up here." And they get along pretty well, but Arnold is not a defensive-minded general at all, and Gates is. So when the American army finds that beautiful defensive terrain on Bemis Heights, and Gates orders the army to dig in there, and Burgoyne crosses to the west bank of the Hudson and continues south toward Albany, Gates is encouraging, Arnold is encouraging Gates to go out there and hit Burgoyne while Burgoyne's in motion, and that way they can destroy Burgoyne's army and have this wonderful victory. And Gates is like, no, we're gonna build these defensive positions, and we're gonna make Burgoyne come to us. So that starts their friction during the Saratoga campaign, and that begins a few days before the first Battle of Saratoga on the 19th of September, 1777. So they have a good relationship, but it starts to break down a bit on their differing opinions on how they should handle Burgoyne's advance.
Got it. And I think you do a great job in the book in kind of bringing out a different side of Gates that we used to get, 30, 40 years ago and beyond, past the bicentennial, which was that Gates sat in his tent and during the entire, the two battles, Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, and that it was Arnold and to some extent Daniel Morgan that really won the battles of Saratoga.
Right.
And one other thing that I want you to go into a little bit here is that unlike a number of recent books, not all, but some, is you mentioned George Washington's role in this campaign. Can you tell us a little bit about how he influenced what was going on in upstate New York from where he was down in the Philadelphia area?
Yeah. So, even though the Saratoga campaign
Kevin, can you I think you want to advance the slides.
Sure.
You have some images of
yeah, there we go.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks, John. Keep me straight. So even though Washington's almost 3,000, he's 300 miles away from the action up there in the Northern Department, he's actively involved. And the way I sort of couch it in the book is it's the tale of two commanders in chief. So I sort of compare and contrast Washington as commander in chief and General Howe as commander in chief. Howe is laser focused on his army, his objective, which is take Philadelphia, destroy Washington. He almost completely ignores what's going on up in New York, even though that's part of his area of responsibility. So he's not acting as a commander in chief. He's acting as a commander of an army. Washington has his own army he has to deal with. Obviously, he's got the big army, but he's also actively involved in what's going on up there in the Northern Department. He's acting as a true commander in chief, trying to balance resources between both departments, which is a hard thing to do because resources are so scarce for the Americans anyway. And he's got to carefully balance the resources between the two. He's trying to figure out what Howe is going to be doing when Howe embarks on his ships. Washington doesn't know what's going on there. Is he going to go down to Charleston? Is he going to go to Newport? Is he going to go up the Hudson River? Or is he going to go to Philadelphia? Washington doesn't know. He's got to figure that out. So he's got all those things to worry about, and he's actively involved in helping the Northern Department under Schuyler and the Northern Army. So how does he do that? Well, as soon as he finds out and sort of gets over the shock of the loss of Ticonderoga, which is a shock to everybody's system, political, social, I mean, the population, the military is just absolutely flabbergasted when that happens, because they were convinced that was that fort was basically impregnable. So once Washington overcomes his shock, he starts providing direction, advice, encouragement to Philip Schuyler. And it's obvious from Schuyler's letters that we already talked about that Schuyler needs that advice and encouragement and counsel. If Washington could have been there, when you read his letters, you just kind of imagine he would have put his arm around Schuyler and said, "Hey, it's going to be okay. You're going to come out of this and it's going to be all right. Let's just kind of pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and we're going to bounce back." And that's the sort of thing he does. And very early on after Ticonderoga, he starts dispatching help to Schuyler. For most important, he sends reinforcements, most famous of which is, of course, Morgan's riflemen, his most elite unit. You'd almost look at them as sort of like Army Rangers. It's a small unit with high demand. So he sends that elite unit off. That comes a little bit later though. But early on, he sends reinforcements. Most importantly, he sends experienced, competent leaders up there. He sends Benedict Arnold up there. Now, he knows Benedict Arnold, probably his most dynamic, aggressive combat general. He's going to put some backbone into Schuyler and into the Northern Army. He's going to inject some energy into the Northern Army. Of course, that's what Arnold does as soon as he shows up. He sends Major General Benjamin Lincoln up there. Most Benjamin Lincoln is almost an afterthought when most people think about Saratoga, but he's vitally important because Benjamin Lincoln had a really close relationship with the New England militias. And so Benjamin Lincoln goes up there and he is instrumental in bringing out militia and getting them to the Northern Army to help reinforce. So those two key leaders that he sends up there, he sends some other folks up there too. He sends other reinforcements. We also already mentioned Daniel Morgan. So Washington plays this really, really important role in the Saratoga campaign. He's providing advice along the way. He recognizes, actually almost 3 weeks before the Battle of Bennington takes place, he's advising Schuyler to watch for things like Burgoyne sending off detachments to forage and to look for supplies and things like that, because that would offer Schuyler an opportunity to defeat Burgoyne in detail. So he's offering advice like that. So he's vitally important to the outcome of this campaign, I think.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. So bolstering the British forces were two other groups. One was a very large contingent of Hessians, and many of their officers, as you point out, were quite competent and experienced. And the other group was Native Americans,
Right.
who Burgoyne kind of fumbled that part of it, as you note, his proclamations, and also he wanted to, in some ways, use the Indians, but curb the savagery of scalping and killing civilians and that kind of thing. Of course, the Americans had Native American allies as well, but Burgoyne kind of wanted to play it both ways. Can you tell us about those two groups and how they affected the campaign?
Sure. Why don't we start with the Native Americans? You kind of hinted at it in your question, John. Definitely, they were a two-edged sword using Native Americans. But Burgoyne really wanted to use them. He thought they'd be a great combat multiplier for him. This kind of goes back also to his planning, because he makes several assumptions when he's doing his planning. One of those assumptions is that he's going to get at least 1,000 Indians, Native Americans. I use the word Indians in the book because they used it then, used that term then. But he wants to get at least 1,000 Native Americans. He probably never has more than about 500 in the main army. So that's one of his assumptions that doesn't really play out. So the Native Americans, on the one hand, are really, really valuable because they can do things like they can scout, they can screen your army from the probing eyes of American patrols and things like that. They can go on raids. They can, they're really, really good at intimidating the enemy. The American soldiers were terrified of the Indians. Of course, obviously the civilians are too. But they're very, very, very difficult to control. The Native American way of war was simply not compatible with the European way of war. Even though the vast majority of Native Americans in the region supported the Brits, with the exception of the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras, they supported the Americans. But almost all the other Native American tribes supported the Brits. But when they went on active campaign, they really wanted booty and spoils more than anything else. They couldn't take orders. They were very, very hard to control. they couldn't take casualties. I mean, they just couldn't afford casualties because they only had small numbers of warriors in these small, tribes. So if you lose a lot, I mean, that's just going to gut your tribe. So they couldn't really take high casualties. And when they recognized that things were going bad, they would just leave. So they really couldn't be counted on. And so Burgoyne tries to play it both ways. He tries to convince them that they're valuable and they really want them, but oh, by the way, you can't really do what you normally do. No scalping, no massacres, you can't kill civilians, you can't kidnap civilians, and all that sort of thing. And of course, the Indians, they don't know a loyalist from a patriot, and so they're just being indiscriminate. That goes to the the famous murder of Jane McCrae. She's actually a fiance. Her fiance is actually a loyalist. So all those things are going to work against Burgoyne. They turn out to be more trouble than they're worth in a lot of ways. Except toward the end of the campaign, it probably would have been useful had he had some Native Americans with him. But once things start to go south, and I don't mean south in the directional sense, once things start to go bad for Burgoyne's army, especially after the Battle of Bennington in mid-August 77, and when after the Battle of Oriskany during the siege near the siege of Fort Stanwix on the Mohawk River, once those things happen, the Native Americans will start to desert very quickly. And so at the end, nobody's sure exactly how many Native Americans Burgoyne has at the end, but probably he's only got about 50, only about 10% of his Native Americans left because the rest have deserted him. So that's a problem. Now, going back to the Germans. So you're right, well over 1/3 of Burgoyne's army is made up of these German soldiers. And so they're German troops hired by the British government to augment British combat power for the rebellion, to put down the rebellion, because they really don't have any other European allies. So in Burgoyne's army, unlike Howe's army, in Burgoyne's army, there's a few Hessians, but most of them are Brunswickers, actually, to include their commander, Major General Friedrich Riedesel. So they're mostly Brunswickers. They're very well trained. They fight very well at Hubbardton. They saved the day at Hubbardton. They saved the day at the first Battle of Saratoga. At least you could argue that. But when they don't do well, it's usually because they've not been employed properly. One could argue, I argue, as did probably Burgoyne's best general officer, Simon Fraser, that the Germans weren't the right folks to send to Bennington. And so they were, Bennington is a disaster. He loses almost 1,000 soldiers there. The vast majority of them are German soldiers at Bennington. So it's really when he employs them is why there's usually a problem, if there is a problem with them. But they fight very well. Burgoyne has a really good relationship with Riedesel, but after the fact, starting after the Battle of Bennington, he starts to criticize and blame the Germans for much of his problems. And once Riedesel finds out about this after the surrender and all that, he's just absolutely furious at Burgoyne for criticizing his soldiers. He praises Riedesel, but he criticizes the German soldiers, and I think totally unfairly.
Okay, let's go to the narrative of the campaign then. As far as we'll start with Burgoyne, excuse me, and briefly, Ticonderoga Falls. The Americans start retreating down to Albany, first by way of what's now Whitehall, back then Skenesboro. Gates is trying to concentrate in the Saratoga area, and you write that at one point when Burgoyne and his army arrive at the Hudson River on the east bank and cross to the west bank, that was kind of like crossing the Rubicon, and in a sense that there was no going back after that point. What was the significance of that, and your evaluation of that?
Yeah, once he crosses over, and he does that in early September. I forget the exact date. I want to say something like the 12th or 13th. The date is escaping me now. But once he crosses over the Hudson to the west bank, he's basically cut his lines of communications back to Ticonderoga and ultimately to Canada. So he's now going to be basically captive to whatever logistics he can bring with him, or he can find along the way. So he thinks he can make this quick dash to Albany at that point. And I think, once he decides to do that, he's going to have a really hard time falling back if he needs to fall back. So it was really after Bennington when, you look back and you try to look at these decisions that these key leaders make, and you try to, or we should try to look at how much information did they have at the time to make a decision. We obviously have almost perfect information that they didn't have. And that sometimes, historians can fall into that trap of looking at, of course he shouldn't have done that. I know he shouldn't have done that. Well, no, because you have perfect information. He didn't. So when you look at the information he had after Bennington, at that point, I think, is when he should have said, I've got to fall back. This is not going to work. He's just lost 10% of his actually more than 10% of his army, quite a bit more than 10% of his army. He's lost 1,000 men at Bennington. His Indians are deserting in droves. He's got confirmation that Howe is not coming up the Hudson River, even though he knew about that before he even left Canada. But now he's got confirmation that Howe is not coming up the river. He's gotten word that St. Leger, who is commanding the Mohawk River expedition, has basically lifted the siege of Fort Stanwix, and he's going back to Canada. So he knows that his supporting attack coming down the Mohawk River isn't coming either. So now he's basically on his own. So he's shackled to a plan that was written 6 months before and 3,000 miles away. And he will argue later that his plan gave him absolutely no out. He had to continue on to Albany, which is, of course, insane. Because number one, there was a line in his orders that said, always use your initiative. Howe told him in a letter written on the 5th of April, you need to always use your initiative, by the way. But he doesn't. He clings to that order and he says, I need to continue on. Whether that was because of his inexperienced independent command, this is his first real independent command, or he really thought he could make the dash to Albany, it's hard to say. It's also obvious at this point that the Americans have overcome their shock of losing Fort Ticonderoga. So he had all the information he needed to make a decision that, you look back on, you say he had to know that preserving the army was the most important thing, and that at that point he should have and could have fallen back to Ticonderoga, but he doesn't. Instead, he pushes across the river and he continues south. I think he probably had one more slim chance to get out of it, and that would have been after the first Battle of Freeman's Farm, or excuse me, the Battle of Freeman's Farm on the 19th of September, when he nominally won, I'm using air quotes, won that battle because he kept the terrain, kept hold of the ground. The Americans were forced to fall back. He maybe could have, at that point, if he would have turned around and left and recrossed the river and continued, back up Ticonderoga, I think he would have had a slim chance to get out of it then. But once he decides to stay and dig in after the first battle, or after the Battle of Freeman's Farm, it was definitely over at that point.
Okay, yeah, good point. And so there was a second Battle of Saratoga,
Right.
where was that really where Burgoyne is kind of on the offensive initially, and that's the battle where Benedict Arnold becomes wounded. But was that a desperate attempt to break through? Was that a realistic expectation that he was going to defeat Gates and Arnold and a large American and a growing American force, or was that a desperate maneuver to get supplies and food and break out?
Yeah, I think it was more of the latter. I mean, he wasn't trying to break out with this particular operation on the 7th of October. What he was doing, what he did is he put together this 1,700 man reconnaissance in force, basically. So his goal was basically twofold. He wanted to, number one, as you said, probably the most important thing was to find forage or to find food and fodder. His animals were starving. He had to find fodder for the animals. And he had to try to get some more food because his men, he had cut his rations, his men's rations twice by this time. So number one, do that. So this big reconnaissance force was going to go out and try to find food, and then also see if there was any way that they could slip past the American left. And if they could, then he was going to conduct an attack with the entire army the next day on the 8th. So he sends out this he leads out, he's with them. He leads out this 1,700 man reconnaissance force. They run into an unharvested field of wheat, and it was like a godsend to them. So they immediately start gathering this. And of course it's the fall, so it's, that's ripe wheat. So they start gathering this food. And that's when the Americans, spot this movement and they attack, basically along the same lines as what happens in the Battle of Freeman's Farm. Gates will first send out the light infantry and Morgan's riflemen. They'll then send reinforcements. They'll pile on. Arnold will request from Gates reinforcements because he thinks he can really cause a lot of damage to Burgoyne's force, and that will lead ultimately to basically the destruction of this 1,700 man reconnaissance force, forcing the survivors to fall back into the British trenches, the British fortifications. And Arnold will see an opportunity, will personally lead an attack into the far right fortification of Burgoyne's lines. They'll seize that fortification. That's where Arnold is seriously wounded in the leg. But now the Americans, at the end of the day, they're sitting on Burgoyne's right. There's nothing Burgoyne can do but fall back at that point because the Americans have outflanked him. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, of course, the next day he'll order a retreat, but the army is just in horrible shape. They're exhausted, and that retreat will grind to a halt at a place called Saratoga.
Okay, so let's get back to Gates again. Before I ask a question here, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those shortly. As far as the actual of those two battles, how key was Gates's role in those actual battles? Because that's where a lot of the books really kind of disagree, or there was this notion 20, 30 years ago that Gates was an inactive observer of the battle. What's your take on Gates's role in those two battles?
Yeah, I think this whole story about Gates being really non-existent in the battles, it goes back even farther than that. I mean, it goes back to really the Wilkinson Memoirs that came out in the early 19th century. The letters from the old staff members, Varick and Livingston, the old Schuyler staff members who despised Gates. A lot of that comes from those sources. Gates was again a good manager. I think he managed both battles very, very well, taking advice from Arnold. Arnold, recommended that, hey boss, I think you need to send out another brigade, and more often than not, Gates approved those deployments. What he didn't do is he he didn't commit the vast majority of the army. If you look at how many Americans are actually engaged in combat in the first and second battles of Saratoga, it's really a fairly small percentage of the overall American army. He keeps the vast majority of the army behind the fortifications, especially the right wing. He keeps the right wing almost completely behind the fortifications in both battles. There's a couple of units that fight. But he does that because he's to Gates, remember, he's this defensive-minded general. For Gates, the most important thing is maintaining that high ground and covering the Hudson River and the road to Albany. And that's what Bemis Heights does, because that's the only way that Burgoyne can get to Albany, get past him and get to Albany. So that's what he sees as the most important thing about his deployment of the troops. And that's why he really only uses the left wing of the army to actually fight. So he does a good job managing both battles. He's a battle manager, he's not the guy you're going to see, leading from the front, leading a brigade into combat like Arnold will do in the second battle of Saratoga. Right. So again, I think they, even though he drove Arnold crazy because he wasn't aggressive enough, I think they actually complemented each other fairly well. And it's important to remember that, a lot of historians, I think of John Elting, who, he basically comes out in his text calling Gates a sniveling coward, that kind of thing. And Elting is this, a very accomplished, military historian. He's calling Gates a sniveling coward. That's ridiculous. They complement each other, but you got to remember that, Gates is an army commander. And now he's the department commander too. He's got different responsibilities from being a division commander like Arnold is. It's very easy for Arnold to say, no, come on, you got to give me everybody, we got to go attack. Gates has different responsibilities. It's just like I almost look at Gettysburg being similar in Longstreet versus Lee. Lee is the army commander. He's got strategic responsibilities. Longstreet is a corps commander. He's looking at the tactical situation. He's not thinking about the larger, or at least he's not responsible for the larger picture. So it's easy to criticize, a less aggressive commander when he's got other more, strategic responsibilities to think about.
Sure, great. Let me take a couple questions from our audience here. First one being about logistics. One of our friends asked, why could Burgoyne not have established an alternate supply line through Lake George, and so providing a line entirely on the west side of the Hudson?
Yeah, and he considers that. When he moves the arm, so after he seizes Ticonderoga, in fact, he talks about this as early as February 77, about where he was going to establish his lines of communication. So he thinks about that. Once he takes Ticonderoga, and then they chase the Americans to the Battle of Hubbardton as they're trying to get away. The bulk of the army ends up at Skenesboro. So Skenesboro, present-day Whitehall, the southern tip of Lake Champlain. So he thinks about, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to establish my lines of communications down Lake George to Fort George and then south, where the roads are pretty good? Or am I going to take, now I've got the bulk of the army already sitting here at Skenesboro, am I just going to use the roads from Skenesboro south to Fort Edward, Fort Anne, and then Fort Edward, where the roads aren't very good, but it's more of a direct shot? So he decides to basically split the difference. He's going to move his large, his artillery, some of the, the bulkier supplies and things like that will move from Ticonderoga down Lake George using boats down Lake George, and then down the road, down that better road. And he's going to move his army basically the bulk of his army south on the less, the poor roads, from Skenesboro to Fort Anne and Fort Edward. So he basically splits the difference. Now, he argues that later that he did that because he doesn't have enough boats to transport everybody, and it would take a long time for him to move everybody back up to Ticonderoga, go across the ford area there to Lake George. I don't have a ton of boats, so it's going to take me forever to do that. This will be quicker. It turns out not to be quicker, obviously. But that's his argument. That's why he decides to do that.
Sure. Okay, we have two very similar questions, so I'll combine these.
Sure.
Once the American forces were entrenched and had dug in, established their positions at Bemis Heights and to their left, why did Gates arrest Arnold for insubordination, and was it justified?
Yeah, he never arrests Arnold.
Okay.
At least there is absolutely no evidence of that. He doesn't arrest Arnold. He doesn't relieve Arnold of his command. Virtually all the contemporary observers say that Arnold is in command of the left wing before and during the battle. So that's part of this kind of myth that's grown up about Saratoga over the years. They do have a bitter quarrel after the first Battle of Saratoga. They have this series of letters going back and forth. They also have some verbal altercations, but after that, it settles into this series of letters going back and forth. These nasty letters. Back and forth. Arnold threatens to resign, threatens to leave. Gates says, go ahead and leave. I don't care. You're not really in command anyway. So he says those things, but he never formally relieves Arnold of his command. And so people like Benjamin Lincoln, who's the second in command, because he's the senior guy. Once Lincoln shows up, he basically takes over as second in command from Arnold. Lincoln says it. There's other general officers who say it in letters that were written at the time, saying that Arnold is in command. So he's never put under arrest. He's never relieved of his command. At least, I never found anything that would indicate that. If he was relieved of his command, if he was put under arrest or anything like that, there would be a general order to the army or something like that, and there's nothing like that.
Got it. So another observation one of our audience makes and wants your comment on that is that once Gates had his victory in late October, Washington had lost two battles, Brandywine and Germantown, right around the same time.
Right.
So one of the major generals is victorious. It turns out to be to use modern parlance, a game changer in the war. And the other one, who we worship and revere, was 0-2 in Pennsylvania.
Right.
So how did that play out? Was there were some folks in Congress that had some different ideas on who should be the commander in chief. Can you tell us a little bit about what the situation was there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, clearly, Washington is thrilled about the victory at Saratoga. He orders, gun salutes and hurrahs and all this throughout the army. But clearly, you've got this guy who's won this great victory up there in New York, and you've got this guy who isn't winning. So there is grumbling in Congress by some key people. I mean, some big names that are starting to talk about, I wonder if we've got the right guy as commander in chief here. And that sort of leads to what would turn out to be called the so-called Conway Cabal, when it looks like there's a conspiracy amongst some senior officers to replace Washington with Gates. How much Gates was involved in this, again, I'm using air quotes, conspiracy, is uncertain. There's a brand new book out on it called Cabal. I haven't read it yet, but clearly Gates wasn't tamping down any discussions of him becoming the general-in-chief. Certainly, he thought he was better than Washington. But anyway, so there is some rumblings. There's some letters that get intercepted and shown to Washington that seem to indicate that there are some officers involved, that Gates might be involved in trying to replace him. Washington, to make a long story short, will skillfully politically survive this threat to his position and his authority by basically showing that Gates has lied to him about writing these letters and receiving these letters and things like that. So he'll sort of put Gates in his place politically. So Washington is not only very savvy strategically, but he's also he's really good at infighting as well. So he's able to politically overcome this. But for a while there, it looks like his position is pretty shaky. But by February, March of 1778, he's pretty much reconsolidated his position and his authority, and made Gates look pretty bad, and also made some of the other, again, air quotes, conspirators look really, really bad. So Washington comes out, I wouldn't say smelling like a rose, but he certainly comes out with his position secure. But for a while there, it looks a little shaky for him.
All right, we'll take a couple more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up, if you don't mind, Kevin. One is, if you could briefly give us an overview, is that this campaign, this victory for the Americans, had an enormous strategic consequence by February or March of the next year. And can you tell us what that was and how it played out?
Sure. Well, there are obviously some obvious short-term implications. Boosted American morale, really hurt British morale. The Brits only have two major field armies in North America. They had the big field army up there in Canada. They've got some other smaller units, but then they've got the big field army there in New York. Now they've just lost one of the two. So that's a big deal too. But the key, I think, were the long-term implications. So the British find out about the American victory on the 2nd of December. That's when the news reaches London. It reaches Paris on the 4th of December. So it reaches Paris on the 4th of December. A couple days later, Louis XVI orders that negotiations be restarted with the American diplomats there in Paris, led by, of course, Benjamin Franklin. They restart negotiations with a view to leading to an alliance with the U.S., an open alliance to the U.S., and recognizing American independence, overt recognition of American independence. So this Saratoga provides the opening that Franklin needs to really get going with the reinvigorating American diplomacy. So he plays France and Great Britain off each other brilliantly during the period of December and January of 1777, then 1778. And on the 6th of February of 1778, all of his hard work comes to fruition when the French and the Americans will sign a treaty of amity and commerce and a treaty of alliance. And so now what Britain is now faced with something they desperately wanted to avoid at all costs, and that's a wider war. Now they don't just have to worry about what's going on in North America, they've got to worry about their Caribbean possessions. They have to worry about, Gibraltar. They have to worry about homeland security. They have to, worry about defending the homeland that they really didn't have to worry about before. Now you've got France coming in, and it's a wider war. It's almost going back to, and Spain will come in later also as well. So in a matter of a few months after Saratoga, now the Brits are faced with this wider war. So it has immense strategic implications. Because ultimately what happens, of course, we all know what happens at Yorktown. The Americans will win at Yorktown, capture another British army with a French army fighting right next to Washington and a French fleet preventing the British fleet from rescuing the British army there. So you got to say that without Saratoga, you couldn't have had a Yorktown, or without something like a Saratoga, you never would have had a Yorktown. So Saratoga is absolutely critical, both in the short term and in the long-term strategic political implications.
Thanks. Folks, we have one more question, and then if I did not get to your question, either in the chat or the Q&A, please email me the question. I'll get it to Kevin, and hopefully Kevin can make some time to answer your questions by email. So if your ticket confirmation email has my address in there, you can email me. I'd be happy to get your question answered. So Kevin, last question. You have Germain in London, Howe in Philadelphia, Burgoyne coming south. We didn't even start to talk about Sir Henry Clinton in New York trying to lead a rescue operation.
Right.
When all was said and done, in London, in the press, in Parliament, who took the fall for the campaign?
Yeah. For the most, I would say probably for the most part, it was Germain who catches the most blame. And that starts very, very quickly afterwards. I'm trying to remember exactly, I've got it in the book, but so the news of the Saratoga Fall reaches London on the 2nd of December. There's a parliamentary debate just a couple days after that, when Germain is actually in the House of Commons speaking, talking about the loss. And he is just raked over the coals by the opposition. I mean, just brutalized in Parliament. And Lord North in the House of Lords, the same thing is happening to him. So it's Germain takes the bulk of the blame, I would say. But there are those also who recognize that Burgoyne was certainly partially to blame, and a lot of people will blame Howe as well. I personally think of those three, Howe deserves the least amount of blame. In a lot of Saratoga books, he receives the most blame because he doesn't come up the Hudson River like he was ordered to. He was never ordered to go up the Hudson River. He was actually, his plan to go to Philadelphia was actually approved. So, a lot of people tend to ignore that. Instead, that he didn't come to Burgoyne's aid. And Burgoyne was so confident he could get to Albany, he wasn't the least concerned about Howe coming up the Hudson River until he started running into trouble. So there's, I would say Germain took the most heat. Then I guess if you weighed it, it would be Germain, Howe, and then Burgoyne in that order in terms of the blame they received. Okay,
thank you.
Yeah.
Kevin Weddle, professor at the U.S. Army War College and author of a fantastic new book on Saratoga. I want to thank you for giving us your time tonight and going into the overview of the campaign and some great discussion too. Thanks for being with us.
Really enjoy it.
I also want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. Always appreciate it. Thanks very much. Our producer, Elizabeth Moore, I want to thank you too. And I just want to announce too that we have some other programs coming up very soon. June 1st, battle brief discussion on Valley Forge. We've got another author book talk on June 17th with Robert Worcester, who has just published a very impressive book on called The United States Army and the Making of America, from Confederation to Empire, 1775 to 1903. It's very good. I'm about halfway through it. I think folks really enjoy his talk. So thanks again to everyone, and Kevin, good evening to you. Thanks again. And with that, we'll say goodnight and hope to see you all at some future event program at the National Museum of the U.S. Army. So good night, everyone.